For information on our schedule and to keep up with the latest history news.
This week on Lectures in History, Louisiana State University history professor Andrew Burstein teaches a class on the Enlightenment Era in America and the ideas that shape the politics and morals of the revolutionary generation. He examines Benjamin Franklin's writings and his community ventures, like the Library Company and the Pennsylvania Gazette, to show how these endeavors were in line with the humanist ideals of the time. He also argues that the Great Awakening, a religious movement of the 1730s and 40s, was in conflict with the Enlightenment's emphasis on scientific thinking. His class is about an hour.
All right, welcome to another exciting adventure in United States history. As I've said before, as an important part of this survey course is an exploration of the ideas that came to define the American identity. We try to see our history in new and novel ways, to push up against the boundaries and think critically, and occasionally to laugh at the professor's jokes. So LSU is not a Mickey Mouse University. But let's suppose for a moment there is a Mickey Mouse University. And there's a professor mouse and student mice. And at Mickey Mouse University, the class looks to the door, and sees a ravenous cat looking right at him, hungry. And the Mickey Mouse professor yells out, "Woof, woof!" And the cat hightails it and immediately runs away. And one of the relieved students speaks to the professor, says, "What was that, Professor?" And the Mickey Mouse professor says, "That, my friends, is why it's good to learn a second language." So, language and wit. That's one of today's key themes. We're all affected by the meanings we attach to words. Language, we figure, is the most logical part of the world. So why is it that we sit in the stands at an athletic contest? Why is it that we call it a building if it's already built? Why is there no good definition for a thesaurus? Think about that. And why is palindrome not spelled the same backwards and forwards? Language, wit. Science tells us that we're the remains of stars, of inorganic material that somehow combined to produce life. We don't know what to call God. We don't have a language. We don't have a uniform language for everything that concerns or consumes us. That's kind of what the 18th century Enlightenment was all about. Now check this out. Thank you. This is by Sam Gross, who's one of the greatest of New Yorker cartoonists. You just witnessed the combination of imagination or imaginative wit and reasoned judgment. That's how you got the joke. Wit and judgment are both born in the association of ideas. Congratulations. You are now ready to understand the philosophy of John Locke. John Locke was one of the most influential philosophers in history. He was well known to the founding generation of the United States, the American revolutionaries. Why does it matter that he was trained as a physician? Well, he and many of the Enlightenment philosophers were initially physicians before they entered into writing philosophy. By the late 17th century, when Locke was writing, advanced studies of anatomy and physiology changed scientific understandings of the body, the human body, especially focusing on the brain and the nervous system. And they rejected for the first time the thought that had been passed down from the ancients, from Greece and Rome, the ancient world. Bloodletting was still practiced by physicians in the 18th century, but in other respects, a discourse about the nerves took center stage. Internal convulsions were extrapolated to political convulsions. The body politic became something more than a metaphor. The mechanisms of the body were linked to mechanisms of government. Nerves coursing through the body made us who we are, more than some godly touch or some godly inheritance. So physicians like Locke looked to the senses, to the sensorium of the brain, to something that they called nervous fluid. Here lay answers about human social organization, the language of medicine. The physician philosophers of the late 17th and early 18th century reduced the importance of the humors and replaced that ancient vocabulary with a new nerve-based vocabulary. For them, everything critical was organized in the head. Empirical knowledge, reason and the senses, experiment and judgment. And that meant rejection of magic and superstition. And that's where suspicion of organized religion came in. And that's where deism came in. Deism, to give you the simplest definition, was the idea that God created a self-sustaining universe, created the earth, and was no longer directly involved in managing it. So for Locke, in his essay concerning the human understanding, the best known of Locke's works among the American founding generation, he tells us, no knowledge is innate. We are born a blank slate, and experience determines the most about us. Ideas enter our minds through the senses as impressions. Perception is one source of our ideas, another is reflection, describing the satisfaction or uneasiness that arises from thought. So this makes him something of a psychologist as well, because he is examining human passions along with a medicalized vocabulary. How Locke influenced politics. He disputed the divine right of kings to rule arbitrarily over citizens. He explained that human beings possessed free will and should learn to appreciate liberty, to obey superiors out of conviction and not out of fear. And he went so far as to write that excess tyranny justified revolution. This comes from his two treatises on government, also published the same year, 1690, in which he advocated, this is a man ahead of his time, an electoral system of government, and legislators who owed their office to an implicit contract with the people. So now you can see, knowing what you already know about the origins of the United States, that Locke would have been an influential force among those who were looking to create a republic. Locke was a cautious believer. In his time, to be branded an atheist was a very dangerous thing. And Locke was rather cautious when it came to criticizing religious belief. Beyond our senses, he wrote, we cannot be certain of anything excepting God, whose rational purpose was evident in the harmony and order of nature. Beyond our senses, okay, our senses, that's where impressions form ideas and where we reason through to understanding. Harmony and order of nature. God, to Locke, can only work through the laws of nature, not independent of the laws of nature. This is the critique of magic and superstition, privileging science over the supernatural. Religious dogma, religious toleration, religious freedom. So we move now to David Hume, who became more influential after his death in 1776, a significant year in our history. In The Natural History of Religion, published in 1757, David Hume, one of the Scottish philosophers, denoted blind faith as irrational. He wondered how the sublime works of nature could produce throughout history and across continents so many bizarre beliefs about God. Natural religion. That's the vocabulary Hume introduced. The idea, growing from Locke, that God is the equivalent of the laws of nature, substituting that for revealed religions, such as we discussed last class with regard to the Puritans. So, Puritan religion focused on God actively saving the souls of the elect, God's grace. And this is what Enlightenment philosophers are rejecting. Two other Scottish philosophers worth mentioning here, because, again, they were influential in shaping the minds, the outlooks of the American founders: Adam Smith and Lord Kaimes. Smith's Theory of Moral Sentiments, published in 1759, was widely read and quoted. Now, I imagine a number of you have heard of Adam Smith because in 1776 he published The Wealth of Nations about political economy. But it was the theory of moral sentiments that shaped the moral direction of the American Revolution, to the extent that it was read by the elites who wrote the documents that we take pride in today as the founding documents of the nation. Lord Kaimes published Elements of Criticism in 1762. That was the work that he was most famous for in his time. And what these men said, as you can see on the screen, is that we recognize in human behavior the operation of the principle of benevolence as well as that of selfishness. That it is natural to have selfish feelings, but it is just as natural to have feelings of the most exquisite sensibility, sympathetic feelings, fellow feeling, Adam Smith called it, fellow feeling. And this is the idea that we are endowed with a moral sense, that we don't have to be taught morality, that it is built in when we are born. So this is something of a departure from Locke's blank slate. The Scottish philosophes, their value to the founders, and John Adams, John Quincy Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, to name a few, all adored Smith and Keynes. They gave the central place to conscience, of a morality separate from religion. And that fed the idea of a republic founded on moral principles and operating on the human spirit. I said we were talking about the evolution of America's sense of collective identity. Religious dogma versus religious freedom. The importance of this issue to the American founding generation cannot be overstated. Enlightenment thinkers were critical of those who arrogated to themselves special privilege, special knowledge, or special sight. For them, their critique, the intensity of emotion in the preacher or prophet had nothing to do with the discovery of objective truth. They said, he who declares that he speaks of a knowledge of God is really only talking about himself and revealing his own inner state. And they asked, what God would enlighten some individuals and leave the rest in moral darkness? Again, an implicit critique of the Puritan theology. So, for the Enlightenment thinkers, it was enough to say God permeates the world, period. They were quite happy to stop there. Okay, let's synthesize a bit what we've done up to now, and then we will move on to the American scene directly. 18th century Enlightenment humanists accused religion of being oppressive, hindering intellectual progress, that is to say, a rejection of science, reducing the chance of achieving a just social and political order through the kind of hierarchy that organized religion presented. They equated religious ritual with superstition or a primitive fear of the demonic. As religious skeptics, they did not see themselves as atheists. As long as religion represented an affirmation of the intellect, that is to say, this is our definition of humanism, then they upheld religion's moral value. That's how they declared themselves other than atheists. Okay, so humanism. Let's get to the core of this. Every culture arrives at a different consensus when it comes to the meaning of what it is to be human. For some cultures, the relation of men and women to God is paramount. For other cultures, the competitive instinct triumphs. You have the royal, the landed elite, the successful in society as a protected class. And their lives matter more. And then there are the peons who labor for these elites. And they are co-opted into believing, this has happened throughout history, co-opted into believing in the superiority of their supposed social betters, even the divine character of a monarch. Just ask the emperors and the pharaohs and the slaves who built their giant tombs. There are open secular societies and closed secular societies. There are open religious societies and closed religious societies. I guess I'm saying no one's safe. Arguably, our technology has not freed us. Even now, we can ask, how advanced are our systems of belief? How much more advanced are we than the generations immediately preceding ours? So when it comes to questions of science, religion, ethical progress, we're still confused. Which is another reason why history matters, and why it matters that we're studying the debates that took place in the middle of the 18th century and that influenced the men, largely men, who produced the documents by which our political lives are organized. What is freedom? See, language matters. Do we have a good definition of freedom? Freedom is not absolute. We have laws. Freedom has no clear, fixed definition that everyone agrees on. We talk about individualism in this country, but nothing is more human than to exist concurrently under delusions of grandeur and delusions of subordination. We talk about equality. That's one of the go-to words in the language of American national identity. But we know, in fact, that no society has ever existed that is fundamentally based on equality. We have our ideals and then we have our reality. So we are still engaged in the debate that the American founding generation was engaged in. We may not be reading as much philosophy as they did, but we are still talking that language. Humanism. Humanism is not, don't get me wrong, it is not the antithesis of religion. All you have to do is think of Pope Francis or the Dalai Lama and what they have contributed to the world through their lives of commitment to humanity collectively. Humanism, then, is not a secular worldview necessarily, but it is a distinctive worldview, and it does go back to ancient Greece and Rome and those philosophers that the philosophers of the 18th century read and adored. Humanism concerns self-cultivation, adoration of what science can teach, an aesthetic outlook, and an appreciation for the intrinsic power of grand nature. That God can exist in nature and not need ministers to interpret God for those who are willing to study science, experiment, test propositions, and seek truth. We don't want to surrender our will to someone else who's going to tell us where we can find knowledge. These are the values of the Enlightenment that our founders were interested in discovering and debating. So humanism is bolstered by a government which enacts sympathetic policies and cares about the lives of its citizens. Now you see why humanism is important, because when we talk about humanism, we're talking about the values that created America. Whether or not we see them, we feel them in our everyday, these are values that we declare to be consistent with the American self-image. Okay, language. When you go to a university and you see a department, it's called humanities. That's where this comes from. Humanism, the humanities. The development of the modern university. It's all tied to humanism makes a moral claim in favor of tolerance. Humanism, of course, reached its pinnacle in the 24th century under the moral leadership of Captain Jean-Luc Picard, the Starship Enterprise. This is just to see if you're still paying attention. You don't have to put that in your notes. Humanists contemplate human destiny. Well, so do a lot of other people. The difference is that for humanists, the emphasis is on the meaning of our collective life on Earth. That the human spirit is something to be marveled at and studied seriously for its own sake. That's why the Declaration of Independence, that's why the American Revolution was couched in the language of pursuing our collective happiness. What is the pursuit of happiness? We're getting there. As a moral community, emphasis on community. The pursuit of happiness is an individual value, but it is also a community value. That's part of the humanist regime. And it stands in opposition to the forces of tyranny that would ostensibly enslave the mind. That now is quintessentially Jeffersonian thinking. That, then, is Enlightenment humanism. Where is this heading? Oh, we know this guy. For Benjamin Franklin, I can do without those. For Benjamin Franklin, a humanist, a self-made man, the first American to be considered ingenious by the Europeans, who contributed to world culture, who made the Americans more than subservient colonials. That Benjamin Franklin, born at the beginning of the 18th century and lived 84 years. Franklin never attended college, but he read incessantly. At the age of 20, just 20, your age, he used Locke's theory of sensation to question the immortality of the soul. He grew up in Cotton Mather's Boston. But his own sense of individuality and his desire for scientific knowledge, self-taught, made him a humanist. Puritanism's, Cotton Mather's suspicion of the individual will, Franklin rejected from an early age. Again, for him, as the Enlightenment humanists in England and the continent, religious belief smacked of magic and superstition and miracles, and he wholly rejected that in favor of science and experiment, the search for empirical evidence. So what makes him important in history, aside from anything else that he might have done, is that he gave Europe an inkling of the potential that colonial Americans had to produce intellectuals, to contribute meaningfully to world culture and scientific progress. And as we know, since we all know something about the historical Benjamin Franklin, to get his message across, his humanist message across, he applied wit, humor. That's how he carried the day. That's why he's remembered. So, Franklin, at the age of 16, was a servant, in effect, an apprentice to his older brother James, who ran a newspaper, a controversial newspaper in Boston called the New England Courant. And young, ambitious Ben didn't want to just be sweeping the floors. He had a belief in himself that he would make something of himself, and he secretly submitted, by slipping it under the door of the newspaper's office at night, these anonymous or pseudonymous letters written by one Silence Dogood. And the Silence Dogood letters were published in his brother's newspaper, and unbeknownst to brother James, his younger brother was the author of these. Silence Dogood, according to, and it's interesting because more than once in his career, Franklin adopts a female persona. He is playful on the printed page. Again, part of his heralded success. So Silence Dogood describes herself in the paper as a widow with 3 children who was married to the minister that took her in as a benevolent man when she was an orphan. She had come over from England. I mean, Franklin invented this whole legend for her. She had come over from England and with her father, and he died on board on the way to Boston. So she had a hard life, but the minister allowed her to use his library. And as a result, she became something of a pop philosopher. In other words, she was Ben. And in the Silence Dogood papers, Franklin writes, I'm just giving you a selection here, you get the sense of it. Without freedom of thought, there can be no such thing as wisdom. Without freedom of thought, there can be no such thing as wisdom. So the humanist message is there in the 16-year-old's pseudonymous writings. Silence privileges learning over wealth throughout the series of letters. So there, at the age of 16 and 1722, that's when Franklin gets his start. Satirical essays with a hidden moral message. Practice virtue without being sanctimonious, like most of our contemporary politicians, yes? So, next in his career, Benjamin Franklin adopted another pseudonym, that of Richard Saunders. He struggled and bit by bit became a successful printer. In fact, he didn't just create the Pennsylvania Gazette after becoming a runaway servant and leaving his brother's employ. They had words. And moving penniless to Philadelphia, where, of course, he achieves national renown. In his autobiography, he explains the struggle that he undertook in order to become a successful printer. So, further to our humanist agenda, we look at Poor Richard's Almanac. Almanacs were popular. They claimed to predict the weather, season by season, for the year ahead. They gave the phases of the moon, which, farmers needed this kind of thing. And they contained, importantly, space in which people who didn't have a lot of paper on hand, people would use the almanac to keep a diary. But Franklin did something very new in this existing genre. He built into the simple almanac, a voice, a character, Poor Richard. And here you see, if you can't read this, I'll read part of it for you. Courteous reader, he addresses as Poor Richard. I must place attempt to gain thy favor by declaring that I write almanacs with no other view than that of the public good. But in this I should not be sincere, and men are nowadays too wise to be deceived by pretenses, how specious soever. The plain truth of the matter is I am excessive poor, and my wife, good woman, is, I tell her, excessive proud. She cannot bear, she says, to sit spinning while I do nothing but gaze at the stars, and has threatened more than once to burn all my books and rattling traps, as she calls my instruments, if I do not make some profitable use of them for the good of my family. The printer, and yet now he's referring to Benjamin Franklin, the printer has offered me some considerable share of the profits, and I have thus begun to comply with my desire. So in order to make something of himself, I mean, this is a folksy guy that readers, ordinary Americans, can relate to. And Poor Richard's Almanac becomes extremely popular, selling tens upon tens of thousands every year, which is why Benjamin Franklin became a millionaire, America's first, and was able to retire to a gentleman's life, performing scientific experiments when he was only 40 years old. So let's investigate Poor Richard a little bit, just for entertainment and knowledge all at once. And with apologies to David Letterman, I have a top 10 list of my 10 favorite Poor Richard axioms. Number 10, he's a fool that makes his doctor his heir. Doctors were notoriously bad back then. Thank you for somebody popping up, and let's see if we get better. Beware the young doctor and the old barber. Neither of them is very good with a scalpel back then. Okay. Number 8. The poor have little, beggars none, the rich too much, enough, not one. Again, his humor is often laced with a moral message, a socially responsible message. He's a humanist. Number 7. Distrust and caution are the parents of security. Number 6. Buy what thou hast no need of, and ere long thou shalt sell thy necessaries. And this was before credit cards existed. Number 5. If thou hast wit and learning, add to it wisdom and modesty. There is some universal wisdom in this. Number 4. If you don't find this humorous yet, wait till number 3. The ancients tell us what is best, but we must learn of the moderns what is fittest. He was different than many of the elites in colonial America, because he did not believe that a 7-year-old should be studying Greek and Latin necessarily, which was the standard for the well-to-do and their offspring. Instead, Franklin suggested that we learn modern languages so that we could communicate with living people. This is one of his innovative ideas. Okay, you ready? Number 3. 3 may keep a secret if 2 of them are dead. All right. Got a rise out of you finally. Number 2, fish and visitors smell in 3 days. And if you'll forgive me, a serious number 1. And the number 1, if you would not be forgotten, as soon as you are dead and rotten, either write things worth reading or do things worth the writing. I got to be a professor part of the time, right? Got to teach lessons. Okay, so now we have a much better sense of who Poor Richard was and who Benjamin Franklin was. So the next iteration is Franklin as the organization man. He brought to bear his humanist ideas to improving his community, caring about others. This is not without self-interest. Remember the Scottish philosophes. But he starts out in 1727 by establishing the Junto, the Young Men's Improvement Club, that would hand out questions in advance of a meeting, and they would get together and discuss. And these were about improving their community, about individual morals. They would read books and share ideas. And these were young men like himself who were not born to wealth, but who believed that it was possible to rely on yourself, study, and get ahead in society. Then it's 1730. He's only 24 years old, when he founds the Pennsylvania Gazette, which continues publication until the American Revolution. He establishes the Library Company of Pennsylvania, which is this. I actually took this photograph at the building itself. It is a major research facility in Philadelphia. It was founded by Benjamin Franklin in 1731 as America's first public lending library. He also with the Union Fire Company in Philadelphia, because buildings were built of wood. They did not have electric lights. I know this comes as a shock to some, an electric shock. But buildings caught fire all the time. It was a way of organizing a community of volunteers to establish an effective fighting operation. And then in 1740, the same year that Thomas Jefferson was born, Benjamin Franklin founded the American Philosophical Society that Jefferson, as Vice President of the United States, would be the president of. The American Philosophical Society was a clearinghouse for discoveries and ideas, science, political philosophy. They would write. It was an extension of what the Junto was on a very small local level. The American Philosophical Society became a clearinghouse for the important ideas that are being discussed across colonial boundaries. So members from all of the colonies who were the intellectuals of the day became members, were voted as members of the American Philosophical Society. So all of these things show the progressive spirit of Benjamin Franklin in his heyday. On the other hand, we must recognize that Benjamin Franklin was a man of his time. So when it comes to theories of race and ethnicity, he is an 18th century man, and he has 18th century ideas, and we don't like them. He believed that Africans were properly suited for servant-like work because he believed that they possessed a natural inferiority to whites. Why did he think that? Because in his mind, Africa had not produced art and literature. To his mind, slaves in America, or servants in America, who originated in Africa before they were chained and put on ships and brought to the Caribbean, and some of these brought to America. Before all of that, they were. That was the assumption that Franklin and many other well-educated men in America believed. So we should not be surprised that with nary a qualm, he printed runaway ads to capture A slave owner would print ads in his Pennsylvania Gazette offering a reward for the return of a runaway slave who was physically described in the body of the advertisement. And Franklin could do this without evidencing any sympathy for the slave. He also had considerable interaction with Indians in western Pennsylvania, and was a diplomat on the Pennsylvania frontier before he became a diplomat for the American colonies in England. So he listened intently to the cultural logic of the Indians he dealt with and looked upon them with a humane curiosity, but he did not expect them to become civilized. He did not expect them to gravitate toward European-style civilization, and like many mainstream thinkers of the 18th and early 19th century, believed that Indians would probably eventually go extinct because they could not adapt to modern civilization. Now here is a really good example of how odd that 18th century sensibility is when it comes to even non-English white people in Pennsylvania. Tolerant Pennsylvania. Benjamin Franklin didn't like the Germans. He saw them as a difficult immigrant group. Why? Because they printed their own newspapers in their own languages, and they didn't want to learn English. And they kept to their own society, and they didn't assimilate readily. They didn't anglicize. And it was that cultural pride among the Germans that he couldn't stomach. So, before you go vote to put Benjamin Franklin on American currency, you got to know these things. Oh, wait a minute, yeah, you've probably never seen a $100 bill, I know. Okay, so there's science, and then there's religion. Take your pick, solar eclipse, or the devil hovering over the church. We move now to the reaction to the Enlightenment, and that is the burst of enthusiasm in colonial American history that goes by the name of the Great Awakening. It is heralded by most historians as an extended moment, roughly late 1730s to 1750, when a cross-colonial movement arose, a popular movement, that was religious more than political, but the enthusiasm it generated was sufficient to suggest further cross-colonial cooperation at a time when the mother country and the colonies were in argument. This is next week's lecture. One historian has noted that the Puritan patriarch John Winthrop founded a community of the spirit, and his grandchildren invested in Connecticut real estate. And this somehow sums up the complaint of the moment by 1740. Material aspirations, and Benjamin Franklin is nothing if not an advertisement for material aspirations. The idea of becoming successful. I mean, he was a philanthropically inspired individual, Franklin, because his inventions, like the Franklin stove or his experiments in electricity, he did not try to capitalize to get rich on the inventions, but instead of taking out a patent, he gave them to society at large for the betterment of humanity. But he did become a millionaire, so he knew what he was doing. Across the colonies at this time, 1740-ish, some ministers noted that spiritual piety almost didn't exist anymore, and that an awakening was necessary, an awakening of spiritual energy, and God had to come back into people's lives. So the Great Awakening was a more or less spontaneous movement, counteracting the worship of wealth and greed and selfishness. It was also a reaction against the scientific rationalism of the Enlightenment. So the Great Awakening, if it had a slogan, it was "God hovers over you, God is present." Itinerant preachers, and the image here is of the Reverend George Whitefield, who may have been the best known, most popular, came over from England at the end of the 1730s and worked his way up from Georgia to Pennsylvania to New England, giving these barn-burning, mesmerizing sermons. Sometimes Whitefield was invited into local churches. Other time, the local minister was very suspicious of him. He was known to call out, "You parishioners, all you sinners, you half-devils." And the more, sedate, sober ministers didn't like that kind of rabble-rousing, that kind of ultra-enthusiasm. But when a minister refused to allow Whitefield to preach, he preached outdoors. And people loved his animated presentations, his personalization of God and God's presence in everyday life. He was in the business, he said, of saving souls. And the conflict that arose at this time was between those who worried about how their polite congregations were being disturbed by this excess of passion, those known as Old Lights, and the New Lights, who were the dissenting sects, the Methodists and Baptists, who were just gaining adherents at this time. The Old Lights tended to be the Congregationalists of New England, the successors of the Puritans. So, aside from this cross-colonial enthusiasm of this several years-long Great Awakening, one of the interesting upshots was the establishment of denominational colleges. So you had the Presbyterians founding the Presbyterian College of New Jersey, which is known today as Princeton University, and the Baptists in the aptly named town of Providence, Rhode Island, founded Brown University. So the Great Awakening was not just a blip on the screen. Many schools of thought contended as a result of this movement. So the Great Awakening, let us underline here, did not change, did not overturn secular humanism as a model of behavior in late colonial America. But it did provide thoroughgoing competition to that model. You have those who, I haven't really used this term so far, but those known like Franklin and most of those we think of as the founding fathers, they were known as deists, which stood in opposition to the enthusiasm of the evangelicals. And again, the definition that I gave at the beginning of the hour, these deists considered the God as the watchmaker God, who started the mechanism in motion and then rested, and then let the earth take its course. God that created a self-sustaining universe. God that could best be explained through the laws of nature. And if it couldn't be scientifically proven to exist, then it wasn't real. Secular humanism remained important, and yet the evangelical groups, the Baptists, the Methodists, the Presbyterians that came about or came to the fore after the Great Awakening, they were respected by the secular humanists because they stood in the way of the established church, in Massachusetts, the Congregationalist Church, in Virginia, the Anglican Church, the Church of England. So that by the Revolution, this is to show you the real power of the Great Awakening, by the Revolution, fully 1/3 of Virginians belonged to the Baptist Church. Close to 2/3 belonging to the Anglican Church, but that does show a change underway. So the secular humanists did run counter to the ecstatic message of a George Whitefield. They insisted that the power of God was in nature, and only in nature. Awe-inspiring only in the way that nature was awe-inspiring. He had no desire, God, nature's God, had no desire to exercise power over humankind or to be involved in the world in any direct way. God's power lay in nature, not over humankind. So, where are we going with this? Bring it up to date. How widely is Enlightenment thinking expressed today? Scientists search in our day, for an evolutionary explanation for why belief in God exists. Not whether God exists, but why people believe. And a fair number of these scientists are people of faith applying reason to the task. Some scientists speculate as to a biological explanation for belief in God. That the brain's architecture evolved so as to keep us comforted and help us to survive as a species amid hardships and loss of loved ones. Still, just as it was in the 18th century, the jury is out. Now, 6 in 10 Americans today believe that hell exists. 7 out of 10 believe in angels. And we took a poll last class, and about half of you believe in angels, and only 1% believe that it's possible that Bigfoot really exists in nature. We'll work on that. A Time magazine CNN poll in 2002 found that 25% of Americans believed that the terrorist attack of 9/11 was predicted in the Bible. 25%. And that goes to something about human psychology that is probably not part of this course. For next Tuesday's class, I want you all to suit up for the French and Indian War. And now, here it is, your moment of Zen. You're free to go.